Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is one of a series of videos looking at the expansion of civil rights in the United States. In this video, we're going to explore the struggle for equality and civil rights by Native Americans. Now, a useful starting point is to remember that the Native American population living in what is now the United States prior to contact was large and diverse. There were hundreds of distinct Native American tribes and nations, each with its own unique culture, customs, traditions, language, beliefs, and ways of life. Indeed, groups were spread across what is now the United States, with population estimates ranging from about 2 million at the low end to about 7 million people at the upper end. But European colonization of the Americas, which began in 1492, triggered a precipitous decline in the Native American population such that within a few generations, the vast majority of the native population had died off or been killed. Several factors drove this genocide. First, the European colonizers introduced a variety of infectious diseases, including smallpox, measles, influenza, and others. Because they had no prior exposure to these diseases and therefore lacked immunity, epidemics of these diseases spread rapidly through indigenous populations, resulting in widespread illness and high mortality rates. The spread was both accidental and purposeful. While the diseases sometimes spread naturally, their spread was also encouraged by some colonists by, for example, gifting blankets infected with smallpox to nearby tribes in an effort to introduce the disease and kill off the tribe. Indeed, it's estimated that diseases alone caused a catastrophic population decline, with some estimates suggesting up to 90% of the indigenous population dying as a result of disease. European colonization also led to violent conflicts and indeed open warfare between indigenous tribes and European settlers. These conflicts resulted in casualties on both sides, but Native Americans with their smaller numbers and less advanced weaponry often suffered disproportionately from the confrontations. Further, as European settlers moved westward, they forcibly displaced indigenous communities from their ancestral lands, disrupting traditional ways of life and leading to increased vulnerability to disease, famine, and social disintegration. In some regions, Native Americans were subject to forced labor, enslavement, and exploitation by European settlers, further contributing to mortality and population decline. However, the superior local knowledge of the natives made it easier for them to escape, thereby leading the colonists to turn to the importation of enslaved persons from Africa. The arrival of European settlers also disrupted indigenous economies and trading networks. Many indigenous groups relied on traditional economic activities like hunting, gathering, and agriculture, and on trade with neighboring groups. The disruption of these activities and the loss of access to key resources also contributed to population decline. And finally, the disruption of indigenous social structures, such as extended families, clans, and tribal councils, weakened communities' abilities to cope with the changes they faced, and the trauma of witnessing the loss of family members, communities, and traditional ways of life had profound and lasting impacts on the mental and emotional well-being of Native Americans. We explore the westward expansion of the United States and the corresponding forced relocations and the loss of tribal territory in another video. But it's worth noting that two of the defining features that differentiate the Native American struggle for civil rights from the civil rights struggles of other groups are rooted in the land question, namely the centrality of sovereignty and treaty rights and the issue of citizenship. With respect to the former, remember that Native American tribes are recognized under the U.S. Constitution as sovereign and independent nations. This sovereignty has led to a unique relationship between the tribes and the U.S. government, shaping the nature of their civil rights struggle. Tribes have a government-to-government relationship with the United States, which has legal implications for issues like jurisdiction, law enforcement, and self-governance. Based on their sovereignty, many but not all Native American tribes have treaties with the U.S. government that define their rights, land boundaries, and responsibilities. The struggle for the recognition and enforcement of these treaty rights is a central aspect of the Native American civil rights movement. With respect to citizenship, and as a function of their sovereignty, the U.S. government held for decades that Native Americans were not citizens of the United States and were therefore not subject to the legal protections afforded citizens. Indeed, it was not until the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924 that U.S. citizenship was extended to all Native Americans. It's also worth thinking about how and why government policies approached Native identities differently than it approached the identification of other minority groups in the country. Think about how individuals were defined through bloodlines or ancestry as part of an ethnic group in the United States in the 19th century. Individuals were defined legally as black if they had just one black ancestor at any level. This was known as the hypodescent rule, or more colloquially referred to as the one-drop rule, and it effectively meant that anyone with African ancestry was defined as black regardless of external appearance. By contrast, Native identity, according to the U.S. government, was maintained only if at least one parent was Native, and indeed, the government often used blood quantum to determine an individual's degree of Native heritage. Blood quantum essentially tried to calculate a proportion of an individual's Native ancestry. For instance, a person with one Native parent would be considered 50% Native, while a person with only one Native grandparent would be 1/4 Native, and so on. The purpose of these two different approaches had to do with the broader goals of the state at the time. By defining black identity through the one-drop rule, the number of black persons, and thus the number of enslaved persons, would be maintained and perhaps even grow over time. By contrast, by defining Native identity through the blood quantum rule, the number of Native persons would gradually decline over time, erasing them from history. All of this was reinforced by efforts to erase Native culture. Driven by the U.S. government's expansionist goals and the belief in the superiority of Western civilization, the government forced tens of thousands of Native children into boarding schools, which violently and systematically attempted to Westernize and Christianize the children, beating them for speaking their own language or practicing their own traditions. The U.S. government and Christian missionaries also suppressed Native American religious and cultural practices. Practices such as the Plains Indians' ghost dance and sun dance, and more locally the Yurok World Renewal Ceremony and the Karuk Flower Dance, were seen as threats and were banned and violently suppressed. Native American languages and traditional spiritual beliefs were also suppressed, leading to a loss of many indigenous language and the disruption of cultural continuity. And indigenous food systems were destroyed. The most well-known example of this was the mass hunting of the Plains bison, a vital food source and cultural resource for many Plains tribes. Destroying the food systems had two goals. First, by destroying food supplies, the government hoped to force Native peoples off their land and onto reservations. But more broadly, destroying the traditional food systems also helped to undermine Native culture and destroy Native identity. Given all this, it's not surprising that the struggle for Native American civil rights has focused not just on the political process, but more broadly on questions of Native sovereignty, citizenship, and identity as well. As early as the 1830s, Native Americans were trying to use the U.S. legal system to protect their civil rights, attempting to prevent their forced removal from ancestral lands, protect against violation of treaty rights, and maintain tribal sovereignty, albeit with limited success. We explored the case of Worcester v. Georgia and the rest of the Marshall Trilogy in another video. The outcome of these decisions was mixed. On the one hand, the decision was an important legal victory for the Cherokee Nation, as the Supreme Court ruled it was a distinct political entity with its own rights and sovereignty, and that the treaties the tribe had signed with the federal government were binding. On the other hand, the government, led by President Andrew Jackson at the time, simply ignored the ruling and forced the Cherokee from their lands anyway. Later, the case of Standing Bear v. Crook involved Standing Bear, a Ponca Indian chief who had been removed along with the rest of his tribe from their ancestral lands in Nebraska to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. After returning to their homelands in Nebraska, Standing Bear and other members of his tribe were arrested. He filed a writ of habeas corpus in federal court, arguing that he and his compatriots had been unlawfully detained. The government argued that Standing Bear was not an American citizen and was therefore not entitled to the rights afforded by the U.S. Constitution. But the court ultimately ruled that Native Americans were persons within the meaning of the law and had the right to be protected by the legal system and ordered their release. Several years later, in 1884, the case of Elk v. Wilkins made its way through the courts. In this case, John Elk, a member of the Winnebago tribe, sought to establish his U.S. citizenship by invoking the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. He argued that he was born in the United States and was therefore a U.S. citizen. However, the Supreme Court held that the 14th Amendment did not grant citizenship to Native Americans automatically, rejecting his claim. It would not be until passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 that all Native Americans were extended full U.S. citizenship. And in Lone Wolf v. Hickok, the Kiowa and Comanche tribes challenged the Dawes Act of 1887, which had authorized the U.S. government to allot tribal lands to individual Native Americans and open up remaining lands for settlement by non-natives. In their decision, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Dawes Act authority, ruling that Congress had the power to abrogate treaties and to take actions that affected tribal lands without tribal consent. This case highlighted the erosion of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights through legal means. But it was arguably in the late 1960s and early 1970s that the greatest progress in the expansion and protection of Native American civil rights was made, and it was the American Indian Movement, or AIM, that was responsible for leading the way. AIM was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by several Native American activists, including Dennis Banks, brothers Clyde and Vernon Bellecourt, and Russell Means, among others. AIM was established to address a wide range of issues affecting Native Americans, including civil rights, tribal sovereignty, land rights, and the protection of cultural heritage. Their 12-point plan emphasized the need for congressional recognition and enforcement of existing tribal treaties and the negotiation of new treaties with additional tribes, the restoration of 110 million acres of tribal lands seized by the U.S. government in violation of negotiated treaties, the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, immunity of tribal nations from state-level taxation and regulation, the protection of Indian voting rights, and the reclamation and affirmation of health, housing, employment, economic development, and education for all Native people. AIM and other Native rights groups drew inspiration from the civil rights movement, particularly the activism of African Americans, and aimed to bring attention to the injustices faced by Native American communities. One of the earliest examples of this was the occupation of Alcatraz. The 19-month-long campaign by a group of Native activists calling themselves Indians of All Tribes seized control of the island in San Francisco Bay with the goal of drawing attention to the historical injustices faced by Native communities and to assert indigenous rights and sovereignty. The occupation began on November 20, 1969, when a small group of Native American activists, including students from San Francisco State University, landed on Alcatraz Island. They claimed the island as Indian land and issued a proclamation outlining their demands, which included federal recognition of indigenous sovereignty and the right to self-determination, establishment of an Indian cultural and educational center on the island, and an end to termination policies which sought to dissolve tribal governments, as well as a redress for historical injustices, including land dispossession, forced relocation, and broken treaties. Federal authorities attempted to blockade the island and prevent food and other resources from making it to the activists. In the end, after 19 months, the activists called an end to their occupation and withdrew from the island. But the occupation of Alcatraz was just one of many such efforts to draw attention to the issue of Native civil rights. In 1970, during celebrations of the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing at Plymouth Rock, AIM activists seized a replica Mayflower ship in Boston in an effort to highlight the mistreatment, displacement, and genocide of Native Americans following Columbus's arrival. They demanded the establishment of a national holiday to honor Native Americans, the dissolution of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the establishment of a Native American University and Cultural Center in Boston. In 1972, AIM organized the Trail of Broken Treaties Caravan, a march across the United States that ultimately converged in Washington, D.C., where AIM activists occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building to protest the government's failure to honor treaties and address issues like poverty and inadequate education on reservations. The occupation led to negotiations with federal officials and resulted in some policy changes, including increased funding for tribal programs. The 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, saw AIM members and supporters occupy the town of Wounded Knee to protest corrupt tribal leadership, inadequate living conditions, and violations of civil rights on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. The standoff lasted for 71 days and resulted in violent clashes with law enforcement, but also brought national and international attention to Native American issues and the federal government's treatment of indigenous communities. And in 1978, AIM organized the longest walk from Alcatraz Island to Washington, D.C. to draw attention to the importance of tribal sovereignty and in an effort to defeat proposed legislation before Congress that would have abrogated several tribal treaties. The walk drew massive attention and achieved its intended purpose, ultimately leading to the defeat of the proposed legislation. 30 years later, in 2008, AIM organized the Longest Walk 2, a repeat of the previous initiative to highlight the need for protection of native sacred sites, tribal sovereignty, and to draw attention to the need for environmental protection and to address climate change. The efforts of AIM and other Native activist groups led to the passage of several major pieces of legislation by Congress that recognized and expanded civil rights for Native Americans. Although predating AIM, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, sometimes called the Snyder Act, was important in that it extended 14th Amendment protections to tribal members, granting U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 marked a major shift in federal Indian policy, granting tribes greater control over their own affairs by contracting or compacting with the federal government to administer programs and services previously managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services. This law empowered tribes to make decisions about their own education, healthcare, law enforcement, and more. Passed in the wake of the Longest Walk, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act aimed to protect and preserve religious and cultural practices of Native Americans, prohibiting the federal government from interfering with the exercise of traditional indigenous religious beliefs and practices. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 sought to protect Native American cultural heritage and sacred objects, requiring federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding to return Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony to their respective tribes or descendants. And finally, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act included provisions which enhanced the ability of tribes to prosecute non-Native individuals who commit acts of domestic violence or dating violence against Native American victims on tribal lands. This was a significant step towards addressing violence against Native American women and improving tribal jurisdiction. Advocacy for cultural preservation and political autonomy for Native Americans is closely related to the struggle for civil rights because it addresses the fundamental aspects of indigenous identity, self-determination, and sovereignty. Native American cultural preservation is an integral part of the civil rights struggle, and efforts to preserve and revitalize Native traditions, art, ceremonies, and so on is not just a matter of cultural pride, but also a means of maintaining cultural identity. This is essential for Native Americans to maintain a sense of self and community, which are central to their civil rights. Language revitalization efforts have also been a central focus for Native civil rights in recent years. The loss of tribal elders and historical efforts to force Native Americans to speak English only resulted in a sharp decline in the number of language speakers, and so many tribes have made language education and revitalization a key component of their civil rights struggles. More broadly, political autonomy and self-determination is a fundamental civil rights issue for Native Americans. This includes the right to make decisions about their own governments, land use, economic development, education, and other key elements of tribal life. Such political autonomy allows Native American tribes to exercise control over their own affairs rather than having decisions imposed on them by external authorities, and also empowers them to address the unique needs and challenges faced by their communities. Sovereignty is also a core principle in the Native American struggle for civil rights. The Constitution provides that tribes are sovereign nations with inherent rights and powers to govern themselves, make treaties, and manage their own resources. But over time, the scope of tribal sovereignty has been narrowed by the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court and the actions of the federal government. Advocacy for sovereignty means defending these inherent rights against encroachment by federal or state governments. It involves asserting the authority of tribes to regulate their lands, protect their citizens, and preserve their culture. And finally, recognition and protection of tribal land rights is also a key avenue through which sovereignty is expressed and exercised. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.